Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched season 3 of The Handmaid's Tale. Let's talk about it. So The Handmaid's Tale is based on Margaret Atwood's book of the same name, and it's considered to be one of the most provocative and thought-provoking TV shows out there today. Now, I watch a lot of TV shows, but this happens to be one of my very favorite shows. It's just so thought-provoking. It's so relevant for today, scarily so. And I think it's just something that has extra significance when it comes to the cultural zeitgeist that we are experiencing today. So for this review, we're going to be diving into all of the characters and themes that were explored this season. We're going to be going through the good, we're going to be going through the bad. There will be some spoilers here, so be warned of that. Without further ado, let's get into this. Now, firstly, The Handmaid's Tale definitely falls under premiere television, so all of the technical elements of this show are just absolutely spectacular, from the performances of the actors to the cinematography, which is always just so beautiful and out of this world, and is able to really capture the emotions and the themes explored in the episodes. Just absolutely phenomenal. And then of course you have the costume design, you have the soundtrack and the score. All of these technical elements are just done very well here, and I just wanted to give these a shout out because whilst they're often overlooked, especially within premiere television, they are a huge part of what sets it apart from the rest of the group. And when they're missing, you can definitely feel their absence in lesser TV shows. So props to the gang for creating an amazing technical achievement in this show. Now let's get into the juicy stuff, and that is the characters, the storylines. We're going to talk about each and every one. So the first character that we are of course going to be diving into is June. Now June is a very tricky character to follow throughout this series because she has become near unbearable for the most part. For the first half of this season, it was so hard to sympathize with this character because she is wearing a plot armor so thick that she will get a slap on the wrist for things that other handmaids or other characters would get hanged for. She got away with so much nonsense this season that it was absolutely mind-blowing how she ended up even surviving to the last episode. So for me, for the first half of the season, the character was just really grating on my nerves. She just has this constant habit of demanding whatever she wants and expecting it to be given to her, and it's sometimes really difficult to remember that this is someone who is going through hell. Everyone in that scenario is going through hell, and when she's asking for something like help to try and save the children, it's not something that's worth reprimanding. It's actually something worth praising. But just the way that the character is just so unlikable at times that it's hard to sympathize with her, even when she is very much in the right. But in this season, we saw a very different side to June, especially in the latter half, where she has gone full mental breakdown. Yes, June has finally snapped. After having been forced to stay with Matthew at the hospital, praying for her on her knees for months on end, June lost her mind. Now, part of me thinks she did deserve some sort of punishment, and that punishment was brutal, but she deserved it because she was ultimately the reason why Matthew went absolutely insane, and we'll talk about insanity and mental illness in this season later on. But June was definitely a factor in that happening because she had ostracized of Matthew after she was responsible for the death of that Martha who was looking after Hannah, etc. So she very much deserved some sort of punishment, but the punishment that she got from Aunt Lydia, woo, that was brutal. This really spurs her on and gives her a brand new purpose, a brand new mission that she can strive towards instead of just living in this perpetual hell with no real direction. And finally, you have all of that leading up to May Day, the final episode of the season, which I thought was just one of the very best episodes of the entire show. One of the very best episodes of television I've ever seen. It was just so well directed, so well carried out. Just chef's kiss to that episode on its own. It definitely helped reinvigorate the character of June and just give her so much more of a legacy, so much more importance in the society of Gilead, as opposed to just hearing about her influence and hearing about how important she is, but other than the fact that she's the main character, not really seeing it for ourselves, at least not in a while. Here it was definitely cemented, and I think if they keep up that momentum, they would have fully redeemed the character of June in my eyes. Next up, we have Serena. Now, oh my goodness, talk about a character who was infuriating during this season. I despised Serena for the most part in this season because it's so frustrating to see her unhealthy obsession with Nicole and being Nicole's mother when she is absolutely not. It was so frustrating. But of course, at the end there, she has that boss moment where she betrays Fred, and we'll talk about Fred in a second. She betrays his ass just so she could have a few moments with Nicole and spend time with who she perceives to be her daughter. But then I finally got it. It made me realize that Serena is going through a mental breakdown in the same way that June, in the same way that of Matthew, in the same way that Mrs. Lawrence have all gone through this experience. Now, in the case of Serena, at the beginning of this season, she attempts suicide twice, like on multiple occasions. She attempts to end her life, and this is something that is just so wholly against character and also against her own religious beliefs that it just shows how far she's come. But she ends up burning her entire house. She ends up giving it up entirely because she has lost her daughter. And when she sees her daughter again with Luke at that airport, it reinvigorates something within her. It gives her a sense of newfound purpose in the same way that June gets when she figures out that she needs to get the children out of Gilead. When it comes to Serena, she finds that purpose in trying to get Nicole back. Now, it definitely feels like one step forward, two steps backwards for the entirety of the season, and I do think it was a mistake for the show to focus on that element of the story for so long this season. I think it did drag a bit, but ultimately it is a very interesting parallel when it comes to these two female characters who are so headstrong. And Serena even mentioned this to June when she visits her at the hospital and sees June being punished for what happened to Matthew. She mentions, like, you're supposed to be the strong one, you're supposed to be the one that can fight all of this. And seeing these two women who are both considered to be one of the strongest in the show go through these mental breakdowns and go through these spouts of mental illness is just so shocking, but also very interesting to see just the impact of Gilead on these women. And it makes sense because at the end of the day, this show is all about depicting a world where women are treated as second, even third class citizens. And even though Serena is the wife of a commander, last season and this season made it very, very clear that because she is a woman, she will never have a place in Gilead on her own with any social standing. And in fact, a similar point is made with Mrs. Winslow at the end of the season when her husband gets killed and she's crying about what the hell she would do without her husband and with all of those children. And yes, by the way, I do want to give June her props for that boss moment because it was absolutely fantastic. And even more props go to those Marthas who cleaned up that entire crime scene like gangsters. That was amazing. So back to Serena, I do think that there were several layers of this character revealed this season. I will say that it was a bit frustrating to see her get preferential treatment from Mr. Chiarello in Canada when they were captured, but I think it was kind of a commentary on how women are always perceived to be the victims and men are perceived to be the villains, especially in the case of Gilead, as you can imagine, because these women are treated as second/third/fourth class citizens here. Mr. Chiarello just automatically assumed that even the wives had absolutely no power. But in the case of Serena, she was making very malicious decisions all by herself without even Fred knowing. So it was very much a wake-up call for Mr. Chiarello when Fred tells him the full extent of Serena's indiscretions. And that was the part that I found satisfying, his realization that this woman that he had victimized in his head was nowhere near as innocent as she seemed, and she fully deserved the full extent of the punishment that she was going to get. So speaking of Fred, let's talk about him for a second. We're not going to linger too long on this character because he is so annoying, but essentially he was on this huge power trip this season. He was basically the mastermind behind the whole propaganda surrounding the plea for Nicole's return to Gilead. And as a result of that powerful campaign, you know, people like Commander Winslow were taking notice of him in DC, and they end up actually visiting DC in one of the most horrific episodes of this entire show, Household, which I found to be so upsetting and so nauseating. At the same time, it was so beautifully crafted, and really have to give it up to them because they did an amazing job with that episode. Anyway, so he ends up in bed with the Winslows, and he ends up exploiting this entire campaign for his own political advancement, which is just so typical of Fred. He's just, whatever. But it does make sense if you think about it, because Nicole isn't his child. Not even under Gilead law is Nicole his child, because he knows for a fact that he is sterile, and so his wife had to actually go to Nick in order to father the child. So he's not invested biologically and hardly invested, you know, emotionally in this child. So it makes sense that he would just start to exploit this entire campaign for his own personal gain. And so it was so satisfying to see him brought down several pegs when he was taken by the Canadian and American forces. He was treated pretty much like a king in his prison cell, because obviously they don't want to torture a commander because it would basically be a declaration of war. And the show kind of touches on the fact that Gilead does have military prowess, so it's a very careful negotiation that they have to go through. But ultimately the character of Fred ended up exactly where he deserved to be, at least until the end of the trial, where he should end up in the fiery pits of hell. The last group of characters that I wanted to to focus on are Luke, Moira, and Emily. Let's start off with Emily because she finally managed to escape Gilead and she sees her wife and child for the very first time in years, and it's a very emotional reunion between them. But other than that, the character doesn't really have much to do this season, which is surprising because she plays such an instrumental role in Nicole's escape, but we don't actually get to see much of her this season other than the reunion. But her role is still 100 times greater than that of Moira's, who continues to be wasted on this show, and it's so frustrating. But honestly, I have to say I don't really hold it entirely against the show because there are so many interesting characters to kind of juggle. Inevitably, characters like Moira would kind of disappear into the background a little bit, at least until they focus more on the Canada scenes, which we'll get into. But first, let's talk about Luke, who goes through a lot this season. He meets June's second child that she had with Nick. He meets Serena at the airport in the presence of Nicole. He talks to June over the radio, and he meets Commander Waterford face to face and ends up punching him in the face, which is so unbelievably satisfying. Yes. And finally, he is there when the children of Gilead arrive at the Canadian airport. He is there volunteering, and he's looking at each and every one of those children, trying to see if his own child, his own daughter Hannah, is present. And the look on his face when he realizes that she is not there is just absolutely heartbreaking. This character goes through so much this season, but you wouldn't even know it. And that's because of a huge fault that I think this show has, and that is focusing too heavily on the character of June. This brings us to some of the negatives of this season. I feel like this show has outgrown the character of June. I think at this point it's kind of a hindrance to have so much of the focus be on June's specific experience in Gilead. So looking at these events through her perspective is quite limiting. I feel like in this point in time especially, the show would very much benefit from having a bit more of a broad perspective in the world of Gilead and following different handmaids' experiences. For example, in the case of Matthew, where you have this character who we only saw through the eyes of June, and so we weren't really able to fully experience her plight. We weren't really able to fully identify with the character until the very end, where she went through the worst of the worst. And that to me ended up being a shortcoming of the show, because it would have been an opportunity to see the horrors of Gilead through someone else's eyes, especially a woman of color who, let's just talk about the fact that this show doesn't really tackle some of the issues surrounding different groups of women. And honestly, this show in general doesn't really give women of color a lot of representation. They definitely make a point to highlight the differences between how people of the LGBT community are treated, for example in the case of Emily, but they don't really highlight how women of color would be treated if they were handmaids, because let's face it, there would be differences in their experiences. And it is touched upon very briefly when Aunt Lydia is talking to the other aunts when selecting handmaids and pairing them up with their commanders. She mentions that one of the commanders is not fond of women of color. At the end of the day, race would definitely be a huge factor in this world, and it's kind of disappointing that the show doesn't really touch on that. Same thing with people of other religions. Each of these groups of women would have different treatment, and I feel like that's a complexity that the show hasn't yet touched upon. This show has very much treated June's experience as like a template for how all women would experience Gilead, when that definitely isn't the case, especially considering how narrow-minded their commanders are. Fortunately, this season does make a point to highlight the plights of people with mental illness in the form of, Mrs. Lawrence, and in the form of the women who had physical disabilities such as Down syndrome being killed at the beginning of the last episode. But the show definitely needs to do more of that, and in order for that to be possible, it needs to kind of get out of June's perspective and look at the broader scope of Gilead. And secondly, speaking of the broader scope of Gilead, why haven't we found out how this came to be yet? I am getting very impatient to find out exactly what happened when it comes to the birth of Gilead. I want to find out how Gilead came to be, and I think more flashbacks surrounding that would be welcome. I also want to find out, of course, what the hell Nick did in order to deserve his position as commander. I was again very surprised and disappointed by his absence this season. I'm hoping that next season we'll get a bit more exploration into his role in the past and his present role as commander, and what the hell is going on in Chicago. We never got to see that either. There's so many things that are in June's periphery that we don't get to see because we're looking through June's eyes, and it becomes very frustrating as the story builds up. And finally, speaking of the next season, we really need to pick up the pace. A lot of the scenes felt so stretched out and so unbearably long. I was eager to see more happen, and considering how much happened in the latter half of the season, it was shocking that they wasted so much time in the first half. Oh, and one last thing, please, no more close-ups of June's face at the end of every single episode. Can we stop that? Can we please stop that? Please and thank you. That's my final request. So overall, I do think that this was a great season of The Handmaid's Tale. I don't think it was the best because of the issues that I mentioned, but I do think that considering where we're at now, they've definitely set us up for an interesting season 4, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing where they take these storylines. But until then, I'm going to give season 3 of The Handmaid's Tale a 7.5 out of 10. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys what my thoughts were on season 3 of The Handmaid's Tale, it's time for you guys to let me know what your thoughts were down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.